Hi, everyone. I'm here with my good friend Michael Aaron Kamens, metaphysical poet, Jungian psychologist, and master hypnotist who hopefully will not use his hypnotic powers to coerce you all to order my book. At any rate, Michael is the author of Clouds and of Absences, some very interesting postmodern metaphysical poetry that I think, in a way, continues the trajectory of poetry that Heidegger revolutionized with his thinking in the middle of the 20th century. So Michael, I think, is probably the best person to have this conversation with, actually a rejoinder to our first conversation about my book, Closer Encounters. At the time we had our first conversation, I was still deep in the writing of the book. It has just been released, and so I thought it would be good to get back together with him and discuss some of the more metaphysical aspects of this book, particularly because Michael actually authored an MA thesis that bears on, some of the more occult and esoteric ideas that I explored toward the end of Closer Encounters, in particular in terms of, let's say, Carl Jung's interpretation of flying saucers. So welcome, Michael. It's great to be back with you again.
You too, Jason, and thank you very much for having me back. And congratulations on the book. It was, I really enjoyed it. So now that I've read the book, we can continue our conversation from last time.
So we discussed what angle of approach we should take to this conversation. And, I can't stand these kinds of interviews that people do where they say the same thing over and over again, regardless of who the host is. And I thought, your suggestion was a very good one, to take the angle of my use of Charles Fort's interpretation of Close Encounters as a kind of superstructure for our conversation. And I want to say a few words about that before we get into it, because I don't want to leave viewers who, don't have the book in their hands with the impression that somehow Closer Encounters is a book about Charles Fort. I introduced Fort in the 6th of the 7 chapters of this book. So the last couple of chapters of my book are structured in terms of 5 theses that I really reconstruct from out of Charles Fort. So, one thing that should be said in this regard is that Fort was not a philosopher. At one point, briefly, I refer to him as a philosopher of science, but that has to be taken with the caveat that, really, I don't think, as I've written elsewhere, I don't think that there are philosophers of science. One either is or is not a philosopher. And if one's work is limited to epistemology, then, then a person is perhaps academically trained in philosophy, but not acting as a philosopher. By which I mean to suggest that when you read Fort, and, all of Fort's writings, yeah, there we go.
I thought you had this one too.
Absolutely. This is the classic, all of Fort's writings bound into a single volume. When you read Fort, it becomes immediately clear that he is not a systematic thinker. So in these last couple of chapters of Closer Encounters, really what I've done is I've reconstructed certain insights that Fort had, extremely prescient insights. I've reconstructed them into a kind of systematic set of theses.
Right.
So one shouldn't be left with the impression that somehow, Fort has this comprehensive philosophy. He doesn't. But one of the reasons why I used Charles Fort, and why initially I actually contemplated dedicating this book to Fort, in fact, I dedicated it to Jack Parsons, and we'll get into why I made that choice late in the writing. But one of the reasons why I was thinking of dedicating the book to Fort, and why I drew from Fort so extensively, was really as a slap in the face to the people who came out with that UAP report. Because not only is it the case that, contrary to what the Pentagon and the various other intelligence agencies involved with that UAP assessment claim, not only is it the case that serious scientific research of UFOs goes back to the late 1940s, you know, they play dumb as if, oh, now we can get down to some serious scientific research on UFOs. Well, let me tell you, not only does it go back to Ruppelt and Kehoe in the late 40s and early 50s, Charles Fort, writing from 1919 to 1932 when he died, he wrote a series of books, The Book of the Damned, New Lands, Lo, and I believe Wild Talents was the last of his works, spanning from 1919 to 1932. In that time period, basically the 1920s, second decade of the 20th century, this guy was already ahead of most UFO researchers in the second half of the 20th century, which is both remarkable and also a fundamental indictment of the people who wrote the UAP report, because it's not as if they're unaware of that. It's not as if the people in the Pentagon UAP task force don't know that Charles Fort was writing about UFOs in the 1920s and advancing some very revolutionary theses about, you know, who's behind mutilations and, you know, the nature of interdimensional travel and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's why I drew from Charles Fort. And I thought that your suggestion was a good one, that we should basically structure this conversation in terms of the 5 major theses that I've isolated from out of Fort's writings.
Yeah. And again, your book is not only about Charles Fort. So this is one dimension of your book that we've are pulling out. So,
give me 1 second here. All right, so the first of these theses is in a way the most disturbing. I mean, it's the most disturbing from a socio-political standpoint, certainly. And that's the idea that Charles Fort has, that we are effectively the property of whatever is behind this phenomenon. He compares human life on this planet to the breeding, discipline, and ultimately the slaughter of cattle and sheep. Basically, you know, the idea that we're living on an animal farm and that we're being bred and herded by the beings who are behind what he called manifestations of quote-unquote superstructures and other basically unidentified aerial phenomena, right? And, you know, Fort is writing in the early 1900s at a time when we were reaching the peak of colonialism. So, you know, this was the zenith of the power of the British Empire. And I think that the metaphor of colonialism becomes very significant in his work. He basically compares the esoteric elites that have governed various human societies to something like the Raj in British India, that there are people who have functioned in various human civilizations as intermediaries and managerial agents on behalf of a higher intelligence that considers us their property. And so this is the, you know, the first of the theses that I
and the most famous and the most famous that we are property is all of the ufologists and Fortians that have come after him. John Keel repeats that a lot in reference to Fort. You find that in Jacques Vallée, that idea. So,
yeah, I mean, you do find it, but the thing is that it seems to me that the brunt of UFO research and writing on close encounters is actually trying to evade or cover over that disturbing realization.
right.
A predominant discourse that somehow the beings behind UFOs are here to raise our consciousness, or they're on some kind of mission of enlightenment, that if they created us with the benevolent intention of setting up a kind of cosmic school for the gradual expansion of our consciousness. Whereas what Fort thinks is that these beings lay claim to us as property because they created us. They created us the way that, you know, sheep and cattle and chickens are basically bred on a farm. And, well, that's a very disturbing realization. But I would argue, in fact, I do argue in this book, that it fits a lot of the facts of the close encounter phenomenon, especially if you consider the antiquity of the phenomenon, right? But even looking at it in a contemporary context, before we go back through the history of centuries of close encounters, which would bring us more toward Fort's second thesis, involving religion and UFOs. We'll get to that momentarily. But if we just confine ourselves for a moment to the contemporary context, we are literally being tagged like animals on a farm. I mean, if you consider the fact that implants have been identified and in at least a dozen cases removed from people who have memories of abductions, there's a very strong parallel there to the way that we tag animals on a farm, or I would say the way we tag animals on a farm more so than the way we tag animals in the wild.
And that's how the abductees feel about it as well. When they feel like they've been tagged like an animal, like cattle or something like that, in their own words. Tremendous
sense of violation. And one of the things that I go into in the second chapter of my book is that, you know, in addition to these implants, we have mutilations. We have cattle mutilations. And there's something about these cattle mutilations that really underlines our own position as something akin to cattle with respect to these overlords, right? So, you know, one has to wonder to what extent there's a symbolic dimension to the cattle mutilations as well. For example, there have been mutilations where, you know, these cattle that are completely drained of blood, that have had something more advanced than laparoscopic surgery performed on them to remove very large organs through very small incisions and so forth. These mutilated carcasses have in some cases been dropped off inside the defense perimeter of NORAD's facility in Colorado. Well, that is not serving any constructive purpose for the entities who did it. It's clearly symbolic in value. It's meant as some kind of a psychological warfare machination. So, you know, if we look at abductions and implants and mutilations, and very disturbingly, there are a few cases of human mutilations that I get into in the second chapter of my book. I think that, you know, we have to take Fort's thesis that we're property very seriously. And I thought in this regard, you know, with respect to the question of abductions, there's one case in particular that I'd like to get into in some detail. Because, I mean, first of all, it's shocking. And second of all, it's shocking because it disabuses us of a lot of the preconceptions that people have about quote-unquote alien abductees being bumpkins living out in the country, or people who, I don't know, you know, were high on some substance or whatever.
Right. Cranks and weirdos as well.
Yeah, exactly. Cranks, weirdos, drunk bumpkins, you know, hillbillies.
Carl Sagan that said that?
A lot of science. Carl Sagan and a lot of people who should know better. Feynman, I believe, Richard Feynman also said something like that. Yeah. And it couldn't be further from the truth. abductions take place in places like New York City. And there's one particular case which is really phenomenal. It's a case that was uncovered by Bud Hopkins, and it involves a woman who was abducted on the night of November 30th, 1989. So this is an Italian woman by the name of Linda Cortille, and at about 2-3 a.m. on November 30th, 1989, there was a car crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, which had two high-ranking security officers in it, okay? At one point, when these security officers approached Bud Hopkins, they presented themselves as police, but in fact, it turned out that they were more high-level officials working with the United Nations as a security detail for diplomats. And so they're crossing the Brooklyn Bridge at around almost 3 a.m. And this is a very significant point, the following. These two security officials, one of whom was the personal security detail for Mikhail Gorbachev during his historic December 1988 visit to New York City, where he met with George Bush and Ronald Reagan, and effectively, on Governor's Island, I believe it was, in December 1988, agreed to end the Cold War, okay? So one of these two men in this car crossing the Brooklyn Bridge around 3 a.m. was the personal security detail of Gorbachev during that historic visit a year earlier. And this car is part of a convoy containing diplomats and high-level government representatives from various countries on the way to some meeting in the middle of the night in New York City, November 30th, 1989.
Right.
And all of a sudden, the cars die, okay, as is typical of close encounters. The electromagnetic field from the UFO passing over the Brooklyn Bridge kills the car engines on these vehicles, and these two guys get out, and they're security officials, so they have binoculars, and they pull their binoculars out, and they start looking at the balcony of one of these apartment buildings on the East River. And they see Linda Cortille floating out of her window, surrounded by grays, on her way up into a bright orange ovoid UFO. And after Bud Hopkins, was apprised of this information from these security officials, he was able to correlate it to other reports that he got. And apparently there was another woman who was just a civilian, who was crossing the bridge at the same time. And she also narrated, not knowing about the account of the two security, the two bodyguards. She narrated the event from her own perspective and said that she remembers this convoy of cars, and that the people witnessing this event were so terrified at seeing what she described as, because see, she didn't have binoculars the way that the security officials did, right? So they were so terrified at seeing what she described as 4 children, with one of them looking like a porcelain doll, namely Linda Cortille, who was immobilized, floating through the sky into this UFO. They were so terrified by this, but they were apparently running around their cars screaming. And she said that as the UFO, after picking up Linda Cortille, flew back over the Brooklyn Bridge, the electrostatic field from it made her clothes, cling to her body, and basically her hair stand on end. And after it left, the cars went back on and so forth. Now, the two security officials say that they were escorting Javier Perez de Cuellar, no one less than the Secretary General of the United Nations. The United Nations these days tends to be thought of, I think, very much rightly so, as a joke. But you have to put yourself back in 1989. as I suggested, a year earlier, in 1988, Gorbachev had come to New York, basically brokered the end of the Cold War with Bush and Reagan. And there was this brief historical moment, which I actually remember, when the idea of turning the United Nations into a world government was taken very seriously. The idea was that now the Russians are going to be our friends. We're both on the Security Council together. If we can just do something about the regime in China, somehow we could form basically a functional world government from out of the UN Security Council. And Secretary General at that time was Pérez de Cuellar, who was from Latin America. And so this guy, unlike many other, relatively irrelevant UN Secretary Generals, he was doing the circuit, giving interviews to CNN and all kinds of media outlets, who I think were trying to prop him up as a potential president of Earth. So it's not at all incidental. This is the guy in the car.
Right.
Okay? And he witnesses the whole thing together with the security officials. He's so out of his mind watching this woman floated into the UFO that when the saucer goes over the Brooklyn Bridge and dives into the East River, Pérez de Cuellar almost jumps off the Brooklyn Bridge in some mad attempt to go rescue this woman. And he has to be pulled back by the two security officers, right? Okay, it turns out that Linda Cortille, who had some residual memories of her abduction, underwent regression hypnosis by Bud Hopkins, and she actually recalls looking out the windows of this craft and seeing the junk on the bottom of the East River in Manhattan, okay? Which is hair-raising, because there's more I can say about this in a moment, but just consider for a second that UFOs could be abducting people and carrying out procedures on them, not somewhere in outer space, but under the goddamn East River in New York City. That's what she remembers. Another woman on the same night, again, third report now. We have two witnesses. There's the third witness. A woman who Bud Hopkins refers to as Erica in his hypnosis notes, says that about an hour earlier at 2 a.m. on November 30th, 1989, she was floated out of her apartment and remembers gliding along the streets near the Lower East Side, near the East River on the Lower East Side in the Murray Hill neighborhood of Manhattan, gliding along the streets, slightly levitating above the pavement, together with 20 other people who were in a similar magnetic trance of some kind, on their way to some kind of central gathering location that she described as a parking lot type atmosphere. And they were all picked up together in this place by a UFO. And she says that as they were gliding along the street, she could see multiple UFOs in the sky going from the direction of Long Island toward the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This was an hour before Linda Cortille was abducted. Okay. So on this night where you have this diplomatic convoy going to a high-level meeting, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who's being propped up by the media to become the president of Earth, is part of the convoy. There's a massive, not just UFO sighting over Manhattan, but a mass abduction takes place in Manhattan. Now, the end of this story is that after undergoing regression hypnosis by Bud Hopkins, Linda Cortille found that there was an implant in her nose next time she had a head x-ray. And the doctor who examined her nose was convinced that she had had surgery performed on it, that there was an incision on the inside of her nose, which he said, there's no question, was a result of some surgical operation. And neither she nor anyone in her family remembers her ever having undergone any type of nose surgery throughout her entire life, going back to childhood. So she decides, Linda Cortille decides, that she's going to have this thing extracted, or at least, further examined. And I go into, Dr. Roger Lear's studies of implants that he extracted and had analyzed with the resources of Robert Bigelow at the National Institute for Discovery Science and all that. I go into that at length in the book as well. In any case, just before Linda Cortille goes to have this implant analyzed, she wakes up one morning with so much blood pouring from her nose that basically her head is stuck to her pillow. And she has her head x-rayed again and the implant is gone. So they took it out themselves before it could be analyzed. Now, Linda Cortille went on to recall abductions where she saw that her children were also being taken with her. And to make a long story short, she believed that she was involved in a hybridization program that's been described by many abductees. And you know, so I think this is a prime example of Charles Fort's first thesis, that we're property, that something lays that kind of claim over us that we do over farm animals, and that at a moment in history when it was possible for us to form a world government after 40 years of Cold War, we were reminded in a spectacular fashion through a direct message to the Secretary General of the United Nations, listen, folks, we're still in control here. So that's what I have to offer in terms of the first thesis of Charles Fort.
Yeah, and that ties into one of the reasons you claim that we'll never have full disclosure, because what political authority will admit that citizens are being abducted, and including children?
Yeah, look, I mean, you pay taxes to the government to protect your person and your property. And if you have a family, most definitely your children. What sane government is going to have its high-ranking representatives, whether the president or Congress, go out in front of the media and say, well, folks, it appears that our Air Force and our Navy are entirely defenseless in the face of an unidentifiable, hostile force that is dramatically technologically superior and can invade your homes. By the way, not just in the middle of the night, but in broad daylight. There have been multiple abductions in broad daylight. In other words, an entire family abducted in broad daylight in the middle of the afternoon, where each of the members of the family remembers the abduction from their own standpoint and remembers the other people in the family involved in the abduction, right? What government is going to come out and say, these beings can come and take you from out of your home at any time with impunity, including your children, and by the way, they're tagging you like animals, and the same beings are responsible for mutilating cattle in tens of states across this country, which, by the way, has been a catastrophe financially for the cattle ranching industry, right, to the point where the governor of Colorado got involved in 1975 and demanded that the FBI do something about it. And the FBI couldn't even identify a single suspect who may have crossed state lines to do something like this with the technology that's demonstrated in these mutilations. So, yeah, from the standpoint of the nature of political sovereignty, this is a disclosure that no government can ever make, which has to raise alarm bells about why the Pentagon is saying even as much as it is in the recent UAP assessment, right? But they are being very careful not to acknowledge the subject of abductions or mutilations and so forth, because they would, lose their legitimacy as a government that is effectively hired by its tax-paying citizenry to protect their persons and their property.
Yeah, it's wild.
Let me say something else about that, which is, a little bit more of a subtle philosophical point. And this is a point that's raised in an article by two scholars, Vent and Duval, who wrote a paper called, I believe, UFO Sovereignty and the UFO, which was published in the leading journal Political Theory. I believe it's one of the leading political philosophy journals that actually had the audacity to publish this piece on UFOs and sovereignty. And one of the points they make in that article is that in the modern age, we're used to thinking, first of all, of the human being as sovereign. You know, we have an anthropocentric view of the world, which is a significant departure from the time when, let's say, Pericles of Athens could entertain the idea that there are gods who are a higher order of sovereign beings, and that human sovereignty is only relative with respect to some, you know, divine hierarchy or celestial hierarchy, right? Or in India, the kings in India, northern India, thought of themselves as on a lower rung than the Deva kings or even the Ashuras who would get involved in human conflicts at various times, right? We're used to thinking, first of all government as human government, and second of all, of nations as sovereign with respect to one another and as differentiated from one another. Well, right there you have two fundamental challenges presented by the close encounter phenomenon. First of all, it reintroduces the idea that there are a higher class of beings akin to the gods of old who are superior in their sovereign authority to any human governors, so that unless we consider ourselves in a state of open rebellion against them, you would have to reinterpret all human sovereignty as delegated authority on a lower level. Okay, well, that's in and of itself catastrophic for the modern conception of political sovereignty. And then, if we're going to decide that because these beings are at the very least highly questionable in terms of their ethics, on account of the implants, the abductions, the mutilations, if we're going to refuse to submit to them in such a way as would allow our governments to be delegated authorities, to be like viceroys of their planetary jurisdiction, then we would have to unify all the nations of Earth in a common struggle against these beings. Well, there you have, again, a fundamental challenge to international politics. And in my book, I go into, you know, Carl Schmitt's theory of sovereignty here. And to make a long story short, I basically argue that you know, together with Schmitt, that the very notion of sovereign authority depends upon the differentiation between nation states. Because real sovereignty doesn't come from a written constitution. It comes from the legitimacy of the sovereign in interpreting the ethos of a people, as is demonstrated with exceptional clarity in states of emergency that require the suspension of the written constitution, right? Like hurricanes, earthquakes, states of war. In those situations, you find out that actually the sovereign, whether it's a single president or chancellor, king, a parliament, whatever, the sovereign authority really bases its legitimacy on making decisions that reflect the ethos of a people. And there is no planetary ethos, unfortunately, to date. Okay, we don't have one. We have only the ethos of one or another community, one or another folk, as the Germans would put it. And so, in that context, the potential of having to wage a struggle against some quote-unquote higher intelligence that claims us as its property, effectively a slave revolt, right? It would require us to form a planetary ethos on the basis of which some kind of global sovereignty could be legitimated in the first place. And so that's one of the deeper philosophical problems that emerges from out of this first thesis of Charles Fort.
Well, it sounds like you're saying that's not possible to have a planetary ethos.
Oh, I think it's possible. I mean, my whole project of Prometheism
Right. Okay.
is ultimately about that.
Yeah. Just
The
wanted to
question is
clarify
at
that.
what cost? And given the kind of pressure that we're under, in this book I revisit the idea of the technological singularity, and basically reiterate what I've argued in other texts about how we only really have a generation. We only really have like 30 to maybe, I don't know, 40, 50 years at most before genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and so forth converge in a way that really allows us to be on an equal footing with the intelligences that are engaging us. And there's no way they're going to allow that to happen peacefully. I mean, if we are really property, then an attempt is going to be made to stop us from reaching the technological singularity. And I kind of get into that in the book, in particular with respect to the idea of zero-point energy, the type of energy that is behind the anti-gravitational properties of UFOs. I see that as sort of the epitomizing technology of the technological singularity. In other words, the creation of this controlled singularity, both for energy and propulsion, is an epitome of this technological singularity that confronts us in the next 30 years. So at any rate, it's not as if we have centuries to develop this planetary ethos. It's an imminent challenge, and my whole project of Prometheism is really an answer to that challenge.
And as a segue into Fort's second thesis, you do talk about in the book how this kind of setting humanity back into, whether it's the fall of the Tower of Babel or the medieval Dark Ages, it seems like whenever humanity reaches a point of intellectual sophistication and technical know-how, this intelligence somehow finds a way to reset, society.
One of the things that I get into, and this takes us into Fort's second thesis.
Yeah.
One of the things that I get into in this book, drawing from William Bramley's excellent and chilling study, The Gods of Eden, is that if you go into the details of the medieval accounts of the Black Death that we have, which people call it the Black Plague, but actually there were, apparently, if you go into the details of it, there were two different plagues that were going on there. There was a bubonic plague and a pneumonic plague. At any rate, Black Death is the overall term for that period of mass disease in Europe. And when you go into these medieval reports in detail, what you find is that there are these people who are strangely garbed, walking around through the wheat fields on the outskirts of towns, spraying them with something. And these same people who wore black shrouds and who had some kind of a spraying device that looked like a scythe, so that together between the black shroud and this device, it generated the image of the Grim Reaper that became such a powerful symbol beginning with medieval Europe, right? Symbol of death. These figures would go through the fields on the outskirts of medieval towns and come into the towns and actually go door to door, spraying houses where people would later contract the plague, like within 24 hours, okay? Door-to-door service. And, I mean, this is actually what's in these reports.
Right.
And people describe that after these folks would go, these visitors would go around, there would be these mists in the street. And whoever breathed in these mists would die of the plague. And this was happening at a period in the late Middle Ages where we were on the brink of the Renaissance, actually, where the phenomenon that we know as the European Renaissance could have happened a couple of centuries or more earlier, but for this catastrophe, which not only led to, the genocide of a large percentage of Europe's population and to, severe infrastructural retardation, but also led to a hysterical return to the embrace of the church, just at the time when the Catholic Church was, significantly losing its grip on authority, and there was a proliferation of independent scholarship and so forth. So this incident appears to have set back the Renaissance by a couple of centuries, right? Now, what do we know why buying a couple of centuries would have been important for these beings? They know why. But, I suggest to you that, think about it in terms of where we are right now. Imagine if we were on the verge of colonizing Mars in the 1800s instead of now. Who knows what it is about the structure of their civilization that might have imperiled, right? And for what reason they bought themselves a couple of centuries by pushing us back. And interestingly enough, when the Renaissance did finally take place, it appears to have been in the context of some kind of struggle amongst these beings, because we have these broadsheet reports. The broadsheets were the early newspapers from the time of the Renaissance that have these accounts of mass sightings, not just of UFOs, of aerial battles between spherical and cylindrical UFOs, and even the large black triangles are not only described, they're also drawn in depictions, woodcut depictions of the events that are printed in these broadsheets. In Basel and in, where was it in Germany?
Nuremberg?
Was it Frankfurt? In Basel, Switzerland, and in one of the towns in Germany in the 1560s, I believe it was. You had these huge aerial battles. And so I'm left to wonder, as I do in the book, whether there was some kind of a struggle between a more beneficent, humanistic element of this, civilization that's responsible for UFO phenomena, and whether, this struggle basically bought us the Renaissance. And so this takes us again into Fort's second thesis, which is that the Bible is not mythology, the Bible is folklore, and it's really the chronicle of what was experienced by ancient peoples. And Fort basically, he doesn't just suggest, he comes straight out and says that the beings responsible for close encounters in the 1920s, or for the airship wave that he discusses at length that took place in the 1890s, that these beings are, quote unquote, hordes of angels, or, quote, celestial Tamerlanes, unquote, that are behind all of the major interventions in the Bible. And that someday the, quote unquote, superstition of the Bible will be redeemed, but in a scientifically literate context. And so, this is the second thesis that I basically reconstruct from out of Fort's early phenomenology of close encounters, namely that not only are we property, our religious belief systems, particularly those of the so-called revealed religions, have been constructed as a psychosocial control mechanism by the beings responsible for close encounters even today.
Right, so that the UFO pilots are the angels and demons referred to in the Bible and other ancient religious scriptures. You also say that's one of the other reasons why full disclosure won't happen, because you want to take that.
Yeah, well, look, think about it. It's bad enough if you come out and tell people, listen, we can't protect your children. Our Air Force can't shoot these things down, and they can abduct you, from out of your bed in the middle of the night. And by the way, you probably got an implant in your head, right? That's bad enough. But if a government's going to come out and say, our fellow Americans, right? You've got an implant in your head, and we can protect your children, but keep paying your taxes, please, and go to work tomorrow.
Right.
Right. That's bad enough. But you know, if the government ever had the backbone to make that kind of disclosure, the reaction of the vast majority of people, not just in this country, across the entire Western world, in Orthodox Russia, across the Islamic world even, the reaction of the majority of people is going to be, God will protect us. The angels will protect us. This is Satan, and God will protect. That's going to be the reaction of the majority of people.
Right.
Yeah, look, the same government that won't tell you that it can't protect you from abductors in the middle of the night also won't tell you that as early as the 1950s, they had concluded that this phenomenon is responsible for producing all of the revealed religions. Okay? There was a group formed, which I get into in my book, called the Collins Elite.
Right.
It was an informal group that drew together representatives from various government agencies and institutions. There was one guy from Naval Intelligence, actually more than one from the Air Force. As soon as the CIA was formed, they sent a representative. It was a loose working group, and I have to wonder whether the MJ-12 mythology is maybe a deliberate disinformation campaign to cover up aspects of this group that existed, the Collins Elite. Because it really went into action, you know, when Roswell took place. And it's hard for me to believe that there were two such groups. There might have been two different groups working simultaneously, one of a more technical scientific nature and one of a more esoteric nature. But based on what I've been able to piece together through Nick Redfern's research and other people who've looked into this in depth, this group itself included, you know, significant scientific researchers and materials analysts and so forth. And for example, they found strange things like that the material from Roswell had more in common with alchemy than it did with any industrial production processes. And we can get into that maybe, sure, you know, a little later in our conversation. But essentially, they thought that the beings recovered at Roswell were something like a homunculus, and that, you know, this memory metal and so forth was some kind of alchemically produced material. In any case, this working group, interagency, unofficial working group, had come to the conclusion, I think, by the early 60s, if not the 50s, at a time when Morris Jessup had already written UFO and the Bible, one of the early studies, you know, of the Bible in terms of the close encounter phenomenon. They had already determined that the Exodus, where you have a cylindrical UFO basically guiding the Israelites through the desert at night and parting the Red Sea and so forth, the siege of the city of Jericho using the Ark of the Covenant, the numerous UFOs that Ezekiel witnesses in the prophetic book by his name, that all of these events in the Bible, including the transfiguration of Jesus, his floating up into a UFO when he was baptized by John in the Jordan River and being taken out into the desert, the intervention of UFOnauts in his quote-unquote resurrection, where apparently a UFO shows up at the tomb, rolls the rock back to the astonishment of the Roman centurions who are there, and two basically UFO pilots are sent down to retrieve Jesus from out of the tomb. That all of these events are on a continuum with, you know, encounters with elves and fairies and incubi and succubi throughout the Middle Ages, and that essentially the entire religious history of mankind has been manipulated by this intelligence, right? So, look, how are you going to break that to people? If you tell them that they're being abducted and that there's no military defense against this, and then you also tell them that the God that it's their immediate instinct to take refuge in is actually a Wizard of Oz type projection produced by the manipulative and in many cases sadistic intelligence at work in close encounters, you'll have mass psychosis. I mean, society will come apart at the seams, especially in the countries that adhere to some quote-unquote revealed religion, like Judeo-Christianity or Islam. But for that matter, even in India, you know, I go at length and in depth into the whole question of the devas and of the fact that the ancient Sanskrit scriptures are among our best records of early UFO encounters and of the intervention of UFOs in military battles on the earth in ancient times, including and up to the use of nuclear weapons against civilian populations, which are described in texts like the Mahabharata. And just you know, I want to get your reflections on that, but just a note with respect to that, namely the ancient use of nuclear weapons in association with Vimanas, or the UFOs described in Sanskrit scriptures. In the first chapter of this book, yeah, right from the start of this book, I get into the subject of UFOs and nuclear weapons in particular. And I really make an effort of disabusing people of this delusion, which has been deliberately propagated by the beings who've initiated contact, who've engaged with so-called contactees. This notion that somehow they're here to save us from nuking ourselves, right? This is all over the contactee accounts of the 1950s, that, oh, we've developed these nuclear weapons, the children have the matches now, and, you know, we got to be careful before they blow themselves up and damage the ecosystem of the earth and all of this. It's nonsense. Read my book. You will see these beings have used nuclear weapons against civilian populations on this planet themselves. If they're interested in nuclear disarmament, and the devil's in the details of the reports here, if they're interested in nuclear disarmament, it is to leave us completely defenseless against them. There's one report in here. I'm going to see if I can find this guy's name, because it's escaping me. But he was the chief assistant to Queen Elizabeth before she actually ascended the throne. British military officer, a British military officer who ultimately wound up by the 1970s rising through the ranks to become one of the few people in Britain with his finger on the nuclear button. Okay, so just like in the United States, very few people have security clearance to be able to actually, you know, initiate the use of nuclear weapons. And this guy was one of them. I'll look it up when I, you know, post it to take your reflections on this. This guy was one of them, and he spent his early career as basically the right-hand man of Queen Elizabeth when she was still a duchess. And he was approached by two of these Nordics, one a woman, Miss Markham, and one a guy who had the audacity to refer to himself as Mr. Janus, which is obviously not only a pseudonym, but one that is very openly proclaiming the fact that he's two-faced and that maybe you ought not to trust what these people tell you. And right. So this guy, very high-ranking, you know, guy in the confidence of the British court at that level, was invited to a meeting with this Mr. Janus after having had a preliminary conversation with this Miss Markham, who was also there at the meeting with Janus. And this Nordic, Janus, explained in a fireside chat to this British military officer that they wanted us to disarm ourselves of nuclear weapons. They wanted a total nuclear disarmament. And they wanted to enlist his aid in bringing Britain onto the page with nuclear disarmament. And this very astute British officer said, well, look, even if you were to disarm the Soviets at the same time as we relinquish our nuclear weapons, how do we know that you're not worse than the Soviets and that we're going to be left entirely defenseless once you putatively, protect the biosphere of the Earth from our potential misuse of nuclear weapons? So he had the foresight and the discernment to be able to make that judgment, as early as the 1950s when he was approached by these two people. And in the context of my whole discussion of the hypothesis that these beings are time travelers, I raised the question, did they know that this guy, 2 decades later in the 1970s, would wind up being one of the few people in Britain with the level of clearance to actually have his finger on the nuclear button?
Right.
Okay, so in any case, I don't think that these beings, have any benevolent intention in terms of their agenda of nuclear disarmament. I think that we probably have one weapon that's effective against them, and those are our nukes, because, to put it bluntly, they obviously need this planet for whatever reason, and we can speculate about that, right? And this is one of the lines of argumentation that I advanced throughout the course of this whole book, is that this is not a phenomenon that's extraterrestrial in the sense of coming from some, distant star system or halfway across the galaxy or whatever. It is very much a humanity-centered and terrestrially centered phenomenon. Okay, so Earth is at the center, not just of our civilizations, but also of their civilization in some way. And so, at the very least, to put it bluntly, our nuclear weapons are an ace card, in the sense that even if we couldn't launch them, and there have been UFO interventions where missiles and warheads have been disabled while they're being tested on a missile range, right? But even if we couldn't get them off the ground, if the Russians and us, the United States, if just these two countries were to detonate all of their nuclear weapons in situ, in the silos, on the ground, that's it. Game over. Nothing will ever grow on this planet again. Okay? So that gives us leverage. For most people, it's horrifying to contemplate that, but at least if you're an American, I would refer you back to the founding ideals of our revolution, right? I mean, the slogan of the American Revolution was "Give me liberty or give me death." And if we find out that we are effectively slaves, a slave race engineered by some quote-unquote higher order of beings, and that they intend to maintain this claim over us as their property, well, give me liberty or give me death. That's our Promethean ethos here in the West, at any rate. So yes, our nuclear weapons are a last line of defense, and I think this is one of the reasons why, at the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev and Bush, Reagan was there, but Bush was really the one in charge. Gorbachev and Bush basically agreed that there should not be a severe disarmament, significant disarmament of both sides, because they knew, and this has been related by certain translators and interpreters who were with them in those meetings, such as the one in New York that I referenced earlier, that there was an exchange between them to the effect that there is this other threat, and our nuclear weapons, collectively, ours and yours, are a deterrent and an ace card that we still hold. So in any case, yes, there is, the disturbing realization that the entire religious history of mankind has been engineered by beings who've used these revelations as a psychological control system in order to reinforce their colonial rule.
Yeah, maybe just, you just summed it up really well there. But just pointing out again that this thesis of Fork's, which you've extracted from his work, and suggests that the intelligence behind revealed religion is the same intelligences that were engaging people in the 50s and 60s that formed contactee cults. And one of the messages you were pointing out was that of nuclear disarmament, and also getting people to be more ecologically minded. But would you say that there was also an attempt there to reveal new religions in the hope that maybe one of those cults would grow, would expand, like something like Scientology, or Was there, because it's also something that Valet has pointed out.
I mean, there's tens of these damn things.
Yeah.
There's the Raelians up in Quebec. There's the Urantia people. I mean, there's, Jacques Vallée's book, Messengers of Deception, is an excellent resource on this. He goes into, I don't know, a dozen different UFO cults. And yeah, I don't think that the people who set up these cults are charlatans any more than Muhammad and Moses were charlatans.
Right.
What they are idiots.
Right.
They're useful idiots
Right.
who become the pawns of these sadistic, manipulative beings that are responsible for large-scale brutality. The reports that I gathered together of what took place in the Amazon basin in the 1970s in Brazil are absolutely horrifying. How these people treated the natives in Brazil. And there, in those reports, we have detailed descriptions of what the beings inside these cylindrical and saucer-shaped UFOs looked like. And I'm sorry, but they're all described as Nordics with long blonde hair. Okay, so you've got these reports of these poor Brazilian backwoods people being literally sucked up into UFOs. In some cases, when they resist abduction, having some kind of scalding liquid poured on them, right? You have, exposure to various rays that result in, these people's skin peeling off, all kinds of permanent, basically, people are permanently maimed from this on a large scale in these towns, to the point where the Brazilian military got seriously involved in investigating this. And all of the witness reports of the beings involved in that particular flap converge on a description of these entities as effectively looking like Swedes. And so this takes us into the whole question of, the hyperdimensional character of this phenomenon, which is really the third thesis of Charles Fort.
Right.
That we're not so much dealing with aliens in the sense of extraterrestrials, although they may be coming back and forth between here and Mars. We are dealing with beings who can operate on a fifth dimensional level. And I can say a few words about what I mean by that, because it may be a confusing term.
Yeah, go for it. That'd be great.
So when I say fifth dimensional, I'm speaking phenomenologically. Okay, people are going to read this and they're going to think, oh, what is he? But, there's all these dimensions beyond the fifth dimension in terms of M theory and all these string theorists in physics today that talk about, I don't know, anything from 11 to 20 something dimensions and whatever.
Right.
Okay. I'm speaking of dimension the way that like Maurice Merleau-Ponty would talk about dimensionality and phenomenology. We experience existentially 3 dimensions, and we experience time as a 4th dimension in terms of our memory and the structure of our consciousness. Our consciousness has a 4th dimensional structure in terms of the way that our memories shape our experiences, and in terms of the way in which we're always directed toward the future as we attempt to actualize various projects that we have, whether conscious projects or subconscious projections that structure our various intentions, right, and our actions. So the 3rd and the 4th dimension are aspects of our human existence in that sense. And what I'm suggesting in this book when I talk about a 5th dimension, which is language that Fort briefly does use in some passages of his writings, is that contrary to what Heidegger believed about our human existence being inescapably bound by one or another epoch and the atmosphere of that epoch, the horizon of possibilities that make certain ideas unthinkable within a particular period, particular time period. Contrary to that position that Heidegger took in his phenomenological analysis of human existence, I argue in Closer Encounters that there is a coherent phenomenological account that you could give of a fifth dimensional existence. In other words, it's possible for people to traverse various epochs in history and to be dwellers in different times. To be in different times the way that people are in different places, and to be, in that sense, part of more than one world in an epochal sense. And that the beings who are behind the close encounter phenomenon, at least these Nordic beings that were witnessed, let's say, in Brazil, or that were engaging the contactees of the 1950s, that these are people who exist on a fifth dimensional level. And I sometimes interchangeably use the word hyperdimensional when referring to that.
And it would be a kind of hyperspace that they...
Hyperspace, yeah. And so, you know, it's very prescient of Fort to have thought in these terms back when he did. He, using the old terminology for the Bermuda Triangle, he said that these super constructions and the people who come from out of airships and so forth, and, you know, abduct cattle and so forth, that they may be coming from out of, quote unquote, the super Sargasso Sea, right? The Sargasso Sea is the old term for the Bermuda Triangle. And he said there could be something like the Bermuda Triangle on a cosmic level.
Right.
And that these beings are not so much coming from another planet as they're dropping from out of that plane into our dimension.
Yeah. It's amazing how ahead of his time Fort was with these hypotheses.
And, you know, they're not entirely half-baked either, because the guy was sitting there reading quantum physics journals
right.
in the decade when the quantum theory was first elaborated by people like Schrodinger and Heisenberg and so forth. You know, as Heisenberg and Schrodinger and Niels Bohr were publishing these journal articles, Charles Fort was sitting there in the New York Public Library reading them. And it's how he arrived at these ideas. So actually, you know, he very much is a predecessor of contemporary ideas of hyperdimensionality that are coming from out of physics.
And of course of ufology as well. You know, a lot of John Keel's ideas he's writing in the 70s at the time seemed new and revolutionary to a lot of people, but you find this stuff already in Charles Fort, you know, decades before.
Right. And, you know, I think one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the hyperdimensional nature of this close encounter phenomenon, which I engage with in the book, is the connection between the moon, Mars, and Atlantis. So, you know, I've discussed this in detail in other contexts, but just to signal it in the context of this hyperdimensional thesis that goes all the way back to Charles Fort, and that, as you mentioned, John Keel picks up on. There are structures on Mars that, based on the radiological signature that some NASA scientists, particularly John Brandenburg, but some of his colleagues as well, have identified on Mars, based on the radiological analysis of, you know, xenon-129 and other isotopes in the area of Cydonia on Mars, it appears that these ruins of pyramids and other gargantuan polygonal structures are anywhere from 250 to 100 million years old. Okay? And there's a lot of evidence that the moon is artificial, which I go into at length in the book. There's mathematical evidence in terms of the ratio of the distance between the moon and the sun, and the proportion of the size of the sun that the moon is, and the percentage of the size of the Earth that the moon is, and the period of the moon's orbit around the Earth, all of these numbers mathematically point to the moon having been designed and positioned where it is. And then you have impact tests that were done by the Apollo program, which suggest very strongly that the moon is a hollow object, a mostly hollow object. You have impact craters that are way too shallow for how wide they are, and that reveal a convex surface underneath the moon dust. So there's a variety of evidence that suggests that the moon is an artificial satellite, which I go into in this book. And then there's evidence from remote viewing that suggests that the same people who built the monuments on Mars 250 million years ago are the people that remote viewers see in subterranean cities on the moon, or subsurface facilities on the moon. Okay, there are these rather tall, Nordic-looking people. And the really disturbing thing about that is the following, that all of these megalithic, high-precision structures scattered on various continents that have been attributed by various researchers to some primordial civilization such as Atlantis, right? These structures in Peru and Bolivia and Mexico in the Americas, and then the oldest strata of megalithic structures in Egypt, such as the Osirian at Abydos or the Sphinx temples. The native peoples who live in the area where these structures are wrote in their own chronicles that the quote-unquote gods who came and civilized them and who built these structures were tall Nordic-looking people. Okay? Now, as best as we can piece together what this super civilization was that seeded various cultures on various continents and that had this megalithic structure, architectural style, right, as reflected in these structures, as best we can piece together when that civilization reached its zenith and collapsed, it would be about 12,000 years before the present. And here I'm referencing, let's say, the geological studies that were done by Robert Schoch, the measurements that Arthur Posnanski did at Tiwanaku in terms of analyzing the alignment of the Colossacia posts to various star constellations and so forth. They all point to the same period that Plato identifies as the zenith and then the precipitous collapse of Atlantis, when Plato says that that took place 9,000 years before his time. So here's my question, which I ask in this book. What kind of civilization is building monuments on Mars 250 million years ago, was capable of constructing the moon as a kind of artificial satellite and terraforming device to orbit the Earth, and perhaps to evacuate the Martian population 250 million years ago, and is still building in the same style on Earth 12,000 years ago? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense from a chronological perspective.
Right.
Okay? You look, there's this book, Olaf Stapleton, right? Star Maker. The Last and First Man in Star Maker, where he sketches out, it's a 1930s or so forth sci-fi novel. He sketches out the biological and psychological evolution of humanity over the course of millions of years. And we can already see, in terms of our convergent advancements of technology that are leading us to the singularity, what dramatic possibilities we have for altering human morphology, right? In ways that would also fundamentally restructure society. The idea that you would have a stable society with the same Nordic-looking men and women building in the same architectural style for 250 million years is absurd. Okay? I suggest that there's something else going on here, which is that this is a fifth-dimensional civilization. The civilization behind the UFO phenomenon is operating in 5 dimensions. it hasn't existed continuously since 250 million years ago on Mars. It's a civilization of time travelers. And the reason why their architecture looks the way that it does, in other words, featureless, extremely precise polygonal megaliths, is because that's a timeless style. Almost like brutalism. It's a style that you would arrive at, and you know, for people unfamiliar with the history of Egyptian art and architecture, go look at the Osirian at Abydos and the Sphinx temples, and then compare them to the rest of Egyptian architecture. Egyptian art and architecture is very stylistic, like any art and architecture. There's certain, you know, type of vegetable and floral patterns in columns, animal symbolism, hieroglyphics all over everything. Anytime a pharaoh had something commissioned, he put his name on it 10 times. Whereas in the Osirian and the Sphinx temples, which we know the Sphinx temples are as old as the Sphinx, Sphinx was geologically dated to at least several thousand years, if not more, before the rise of Egyptian civilization by Robert Schoch, who identified water erosion on the body of the Sphinx. And the Sphinx temples were made from the rock that was hewn from out of the Sphinx trench. So we know they're as old. The Sphinx temple is in this austere, featureless, anonymous, megalithic style, just like the Osirian at Abydos, which is under 8,000 years of sedimentation. So what I'm suggesting is that these people have a style that's similar to brutalism. It represents a consciousness that considers itself beyond change, that basically it's been there and done that. It's been through all forms of social and psychological permutations that yield different art styles, and it has achieved perfection. It's achieved what it considers to be the culmination of human development. Okay? And I think that's a good point of departure for getting into Fort's fourth and fifth theses, which have to do with a whole other dimension of the close encounter phenomenon, besides this Nordic breakaway civilization, insofar as I think, and I argue in this book, that there's another source of close encounters. And this other type of intelligence, other with a capital O, type of intelligence, in the sense of something truly alien, in a way, is challenging the Nordic time travelers, specifically with respect to what it believes is their deluded conviction that they have reached the culmination of all possible human development and effectively achieved perfection.
Yeah, and you also talk about, with respect to the architecture, at the end of the book, that architectural style of this fifth dimensional civilization could psychologically symbolize an attempt to block out this thing that they discovered, this fifth dimensional trickster superorganism that has a deconstructive effect on any system that is too rigid, and they've blocked themselves off from it, and that maybe the architecture even symbolizes that in some way. But we can get, that's the direction that we're headed in. So you're saying that Charles Fort's fourth thesis is that he thinks the phenomenon is associated with some kind of trickster whose behavior can range from the display of wonder, evoking marvels, to downright horrific malevolence.
Yeah, let me pick up on what you said right now.
Yeah.
Look at the fortification wall at Sacsayhuaman in South America. It epitomizes a fortress mentality that is endemic to all of these megalithic structures that are remnants of quote-unquote Atlantis. Not only do these structures evince a kind of conviction that perfection has been achieved, such that their society is a microcosm of the macrocosm of cosmic order, right? But I think there is something else going on here, namely that you have here a civilization that is psychologically fortifying itself against a destructuring force that is capable of materializing a disturbingly wide range of paranormal phenomena. Okay, so that the jigsaw pattern of these blocks that are fitted together so perfectly that you can't even slip a razor blade between the joints of these megalithic constructions can also be read psychoanalytically as the expression of a kind of consciousness that has walled itself off from an alien threat, right? And it's trying to keep it out at all costs. And this is the trickster that people who, you know, have really studied the close encounter phenomenon in any depth have come up against. I mean, the best examples of this are John Keel, not just in Operation Trojan Horse, but in the Mothman prophecies.
Right.
And also Jacques Vallée. But it's a thesis that goes back to Charles Fort. And to Charles Fort's observations, this is the fourth thesis of Fort that I get into. Charles Fort's observations that there seems to be a black humor behind a lot of these manifestations. And I mean, when I say black, I really mean black. Black humor or dark humor, like Dr. Strangelovian kind of humor. If you look at some of the events that happened on Skinwalker Ranch, which is in the Uinta Basin in Utah, property that was named after the local Ute Indian legends of a malevolent trickster, namely the Skinwalker, the kinds of phenomena that take place on this ranch display not only a precognitive intelligence, but a really disturbing sense of humor. You know, definitely the type of prankster behavior that you also see in some poltergeist incidents, and that you witnessed in terms of the mediumistic phenomena in seances in the late 19th century as well. So to just give you one example that I cover in my book, they had these cameras running on Skinwalker Ranch, which were paid for by Robert Bigelow and his National National Institute of Discovery Science, NIDS, group of scientists that Bigelow brought together in the 1990s to study Skinwalker Ranch. And, you know, so among the various sensors and monitoring systems that these scientists had set up were a network of cameras that would basically run 24/7 and surveil the property. And somehow the various phenomena that would manifest on this property knew exactly what the range of footage of these cameras was, what their scope of coverage was, and would stay just outside the scope of coverage of these cameras whenever a new camera was set up. Except for in one instance where what wasn't seen on the camera is more disturbing than anything that could have been captured by the cameras, okay? And basically here's what happened. You had these two cameras that were within each other's field of vision. And one of the cameras went offline. And the other camera, and these are taking one shot every second and a third, okay? So in just over 1 second, the frame refreshes. And so the camera that went offline is on top of a 20-foot pole. And it's under observation from the second camera at the moment that it goes offline. The scientists go out to the field to find out why this camera went offline, camera number one. And they see that the wires running up the pole to this camera have been cut. When they analyzed the wires carefully, they found the wires were cut by a rusty scalpel or scissor, some kind of rusty metal instrument. The duct tape that was sealing the wires to the pole had been entirely removed. And, okay, I'm sure people have had experience with duct tape. Imagine a 20-foot pole with wires running up it to a camera, and all these wires are duct taped to the camera.
Right.
In a little over 1 second, something came, cut the wires, and removed all of the duct tape. I mean, to the point where, like, they goo-goned the wires and there's no remnant of duct tape on the wires or on the pole. In a little over 1 second. Moreover, there were animals grazing near the pole, and the animals weren't startled by anything or anyone. They were under observation from camera 2 as well, while camera 1 went offline. Okay? So something cut into our space-time continuum.
Right.
The way you cut into frames of a movie film.
Mm.
And did this. Well, I mean, I don't know how else you can conceive of that other than as hyperdimensional.
Right. It's, you know, you also described the trickster having access to the universe as a cosmic computational system, and it could therefore sort of delete the file of the duct tape and the wires, or insert some other reality there, and it shows up in our space-time as a second passing, but from this higher reference level of the fifth dimension. So yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. That's really cool.
That's right. And, on Skinwalker Ranch, the other thing that was encountered, together with every form of UFO you can imagine, from triangles to saucers to whatever, they saw, a whole range of different size and shaped UFOs, Bigfoot, etc. But the other thing that was encountered on Skinwalker Ranch that's very relevant to, whatever trickster phenomena it was that dismantled this camera, is something that they called the Predator, because it reminded them of the alien in the movie Predator, insofar as it appeared to be a camouflaged being. This thing would come from out of the woods, and it was invisible, except that you could kind of see a shimmer or distortion, a pixelation of whatever was behind this thing as it moved around.
Right.
But it basically had the capability to render itself invisible, and to throw the animals there into a panic. It once parted the cattle herd like the cylindrical UFO parting the Red Sea. It utterly terrified some hippy-dippy guy who came onto the Skinwalker Ranch and begged to be able to meditate there and commune with whatever cosmic intelligences were at work. The guy was sitting out there in the middle of the field, basically trying to commune with whatever's on Skinwalker Ranch, and this thing snuck up on him and let out the most bone-chilling growl that any of those guys present had ever heard. And basically, this adept meditator collapsed into a puddle of hysterical emotions, and had to be effectively carried to his car. So why is this significant? And by the way, I include, in conjunction with this Predator sighting on Skinwalker Ranch, another case of such an entity that was documented by Bruce Maccabee, an entity that was actually observed by the physicist and UFO researcher Bruce Maccabee's wife, who's a deer hunter, at a deer bluff in the woods behind their home. She actually encountered an entity just like this at a time when there was a UFO sighting over the nearby high school. And same description, it was invisible, except it caused sort of a distortion of, in this case, the trees that it was climbing in between, right? And in the case of Bruce Maccabee's wife, when she tried to take a picture of this thing, because she had her camera with her for a deer hunt, the thing altered the basic settings of the camera so that you could see the images before and the images after these few shots were taken, and they're normal camera resolution settings, but the few shots she tried to take of this thing are at resolution settings that are unavailable on the, I think it was Samsung or BlackBerry camera that she was using. Okay, and Bruce Maccabee being Maccabee physicist contacted the freaking camera company and said to them, "What? How do you do?" They said, "Listen, you can't do this unless you get into the software." So in a split second, this thing hacked the phone and changed the resolution. Okay, so my point is this: that this is not the Nordic breakaway civilization. There's something else here, and this something else that can render itself invisible, that can cut into our 4D spatiotemporal fabric as if from a fifth dimension and do all that damage to the camera pole, right, in under a second and a third. That thing doesn't need to show up as a flying saucer.
Right.
And yet, that thing is very closely associated with flying saucers and flying triangles and whatever that show up at places like Skinwalker Ranch. And so the question that we then have to ask ourselves is, could it be the case that some subset of close encounters involve encounters not with people like ourselves or extraterrestrial biological entities, but are encounters with various projections, manifestations, instantiations of this trickster intelligence?
Which is a superorganism, essentially. One thing that I really enjoyed in the book was how you compare this trickster to the octopus and the details you go into that. And there was this paper by 33 scientists that speculated about the octopus perhaps not evolving on Earth, or something about its evolution not making sense within what we know about that. And the octopus also plays tricks and has a kind of sense of humor. You pointed out. Do you want to say anything about that connection?
Yes, and this will be on a trajectory into the fifth and final thesis that I have from out of the writings of Fort. There was this paper published in a leading scientific journal with about 30 different authors from many top universities. And they effectively argued that the biological capacities of the octopus and the genetic code that affords it those capabilities is not consistent with the evolutionary matrix of our planet at the present time. In other words, to summarize what's a very complex idea, evolutionary biologists have pretty rigorously mapped out the successive phases in the increasing complexity of biological life on this planet, from geological epoch to geological epoch. So after every mass extinction event, like the Cambrian extinction, the Permian extinction, there is a reemergence of life, apparently with a greater degree of complexity. So that even the simplest, let me rephrase that, so that even a monkey, right, like one of these like circus monkeys, is more complex biologically in terms of its genetic code and its capacities than the most complex life form in the Cambrian era. Right. There is a kind of across the board genetic complexity that has a signature in one or another geological epoch. And of course, there's dramatically variant complexity from life form to life form and within each species in any given epoch. But there is a kind of across the board level of biological complexity on the planet Earth in a given epoch, right? That has to do with, you know, the number of coding sequences that there are in the genome of certain species and the kinds of capacities that it affords those species. Well, it turns out that the octopus, which has long been assumed to be a descendant of the Nautilus in the primordial oceans of Earth, believed that the octopus evolved from the Nautilus. Problem is that according to these scientists, the genetic code of the octopus and the capacities that are afforded by it are too complex to be consistent with Earth in the present or in any past epoch. That there are one of two possibilities that they put forth in this paper. One is that the octopus came here from space, that it's an alien, that there were basically frozen octopus eggs inside of a comet that maybe broke off of a moon like Titan or Europa. We know there's probably ocean life on Titan or Europa. And that maybe the octopus is from a world like that, and frozen octopus eggs made it to the oceans of Earth, and that's how basically the biological matrix of an older and more complex world was transplanted into the oceans of Earth. I suggest in this book that, you know, we have no reason to believe that that's the case. I mean, there's no other data that would independently confirm that thesis. So why not consider the other possibility which they raise and just as quickly dismiss, because I think it deeply disturbs them to consider this other possibility, which they raise themselves. And that's that the octopus is from the future biological matrix of the Earth. So it is evolved from the Nautilus, just not yet, millions of years into the future. And I set this in the context of the Bermuda Triangle, or what Charles Fort called the Sargasso Sea. We know, based on an analysis of what kinds of things go on in the Bermuda Triangle, that it's some kind of hyperdimensional vortex. And I lay out, you know, at length in this book the thesis that because UFOs are time machines, UFO bases are the location of spatiotemporal vortices, that UFO bases create hyperdimensional distortions. And I go into all kinds of data that would support that argument. Data basically involving missing persons at various locations that appear to be something like the Bermuda Triangle on land. Vortices that people disappear into and appear to go into another time and then come back from out of in some cases. In some cases only their things come back. In other cases, they appear to have gone into past epochs and left things there, and those things have become anomalous artifacts in geological strata that are millions of years old. In any case, when we set this research on the octopus in the context of the Bermuda Triangle, and the idea that, you know, half of UFOs are seen entering and exiting the oceans, 70% of our planet surface consists of the oceans. And for some reason that really ought to be explained to us, only 5% of the oceans have been explored. We know more about the surface of other planets in our solar system than we know about the floor of our own oceans. 5% of the 70% of our planet that is ocean has been explored. Okay? So probably there are UFO bases honeycombing the oceans of the Earth. Because again, half of UFOs are seen entering and exiting the oceans, right, including, by the way, these UFOs that the Navy recently has filmed. They're all ocean-based UFOs. So I suggest that if there are hyperdimensional vortices in the ocean, perhaps the octopus came from far in the future into our oceans the way that people sometimes disappear into an epoch millions of years into the past and leave things there that wind up as anomalous artifacts in very primordial geological strata. And then I raised the question, well, if the octopus has all of these extraordinary capacities, and I go into what they are, you know, these biological capacities that suggested to this team of scientists that this thing can't possibly have evolved on the Earth up to the present. What if something else came through that vortex together with the octopus? In other words, what if the octopuses were basically along for the ride? What if they are to this thing what monkeys are to us? And this other thing also came through the vortices. And that there's an intelligence, has been for millions of years, an intelligence in the oceans of Earth that is far more evolved than us. And that, like the octopus, has the mentality of a trickster. I go into, you know, how playful and deceptive and cunning octopuses are. And I imagine a life form very much like them, but much more advanced, that could be projecting various elements of the close encounter phenomenon. And here, mediumistic phenomena from the late 19th century are very relevant. To understand, okay, two things. First of all, in addition to their extraordinary shape-shifting capability, their color and texture changing capacities for predator evasion, and various other behaviors of an octopus that display a very high level of intelligence and also personality. In addition to all of that, it appears that the octopus is the most psychic animal on the Earth, including humans, because we've had all these studies that Rupert Sheldrake has summarized, which I covered at length in Prometheus and Atlas. Studies of psychic ability in dogs, in horses, various animals. And none of them come close to displaying the kind of psychic ability that an octopus named Paul demonstrated to people in Germany in the early 2000s. So there was this octopus living in captivity in Germany who unfortunately only grew to be 2 years old. Okay, we're talking about a 2-year-old octopus who was able to predict the outcome of 14 sports games with 85% accuracy. So this octopus, it would have two boxes in front of it with, like, I don't know, like a mussel in one and a crab or something in the other, some, attractive food item inside these two boxes. And on top of these, the lids of these two boxes, these two transparent containers, would be the flags of two rival football teams, soccer teams. And this octopus, Paul, in front of an assembled crowd, which Paul liked to show off in front of, this octopus guessed the outcome of sports game after sports game accurately by lifting the lid off the container bearing the flag of the winning team in 12 out of, I think, 14 guesses that it made over the course of the 2 years that it was alive. That's a higher success rate in ESP than has been demonstrated by any animal or human ever in any parapsychology laboratory. So, okay, if that's the case, no one thought to test the PK abilities of an octopus. But what I'm asking myself is, if the octopus came along for the ride, and it is to some other thing what a monkey is to us, what would be the psychokinetic capacities of that thing? When we consider the fact that in the late 19th century, mediums like Daniel Douglas Hume were able to levitate tables and levitate their own bodies feet off of the ground, right? Many feet off of the ground. When Eusebio Palladino and other mediums in the late 19th century could materialize ectoplasmic people inside of cabinets could manifest hands, disconnected from anybody, hands that would go around a seance table and shake hands with the people sitting there. Phenomena that were witnessed by scientists of the caliber of Sir William Crookes. So if people are capable of that kind of ectoplasmic materialization, what could this entity do? And how much of what we consider to be alien in the context of Close Encounters is actually materialization by this thing in Earth's oceans, which has a trickster mentality. And particularly when I broach this subject, I go into a handful of examples of entities involved in Close Encounters that I think are symbolic manifestations of the trickster, which include owls that are seen ubiquitously in the context of close encounter phenomena, mantids, and also the men in black. So, people have the impression, people who aren't familiar with the close encounter literature, that these men in black, who dress like you, except the fedora hat and usually clean shaven, and who look, who look like, they are. Okay, let me put it to you this way. If you actually go into the details of accounts of encounters with these men in black, they don't look like people from any government agency, okay? They don't even look human, properly speaking. And by that, I don't mean that they look like aliens either. These things don't speak or act like autonomous conscious beings. They, John Keel has excellent accounts of this in the Mothman Prophecy or Operation Trojan Horse. They appear to be some kind of a sustained mesmeric projection from somewhere else, as if something is trying to hold a mental image, and it's limited in its capacity to convey information through this materialized mental image, as if like it is projecting an egregore or a tulpa somewhere, and these things run down after a while, and they don't look quite right, and they certainly don't speak like any human being should intelligibly speak, or like any advanced intelligent alien should be able to convey information. And
sometimes they're not coordinated either, right? There's stories of a man in black goes to a restaurant and doesn't know how to use a fork, doesn't understand, tries to eat his steak with a spoon or something like that. People in the restaurant are like, "The hell's going on?"
Their behavior is absurd.
Yeah.
They are more uncanny in their mannerisms than someone in a mesmeric trance, and they also appear and disappear from out of nowhere. That's been noted in these reports as well, as if they're materializations. Albert Bender was a guy who set up one of the early flying saucer research organizations in the United States. And these things used to materialize in his attic, where he had his little flying saucer bureau. And he said there was the smell of sulfur every time these things would basically materialize in his attic. And so I think we're dealing with something like egregores and tulpas. Then the question becomes, well, what's projecting them?
Right.
And whatever's projecting them is interested in managing information about the close encounter phenomenon, because that's what these entities do. These men in black basically engage anyone who's had a close encounter, and by posing as government officials or whatever, representatives from the military, etc., they attempt to intimidate witnesses, and manage information related to close encounters. So they're one example of what I describe as the tentacles of the trickster toward the end of closer encounters. But again, as I suggested earlier, there's also a lot of shamanic imagery involved with this trickster, particularly the symbolism of owls and the symbolism of mantids. And I get into why I think it is that this trickster intelligence has chosen these two life forms in particular in order to convey symbolic information about itself and its intentions and modus operandi. And this brings us, really to Fort's fifth and final thesis, which in a way we've already been talking about,
right.
Which where Fort comes closest to being a sort of philosopher of science, and that's the idea that the trickster is a destructuring force. Okay, so to the extent that this Nordic breakaway civilization believes it has achieved perfection and that its form of human society is a utopia, a society that includes a rigid hierarchical caste system and that it effectively was a slave state, right? Back in the days of Atlantis and all the, societies modeled on Atlantis, from the caste system of Hindu India to the pharaonic state of Egypt. The trickster is challenging this closed society, this fifth dimensional society, in order to catalyze further human evolution. Because basically, this Nordic breakaway civilization has reached an evolutionary bottleneck. And I set this in the context of Fort's writings about the succession of dominance, as he calls it. So Fort has an overarching thesis about paranormal phenomena. He has an overarching interpretive framework that he filters all of the data through, that he amassed from all these journals and the libraries where, he worked from morning till night, collecting this archival material. And this overarching thesis is that in one or another epoch, certain types of phenomena are marginalized as impossible so that other types of phenomena can be reified as something like laws of nature and structures of possible experience, which immediately should make you think of paradigm in the discourse of Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. But actually, I argue in here that Fort is a lot more radical than Kuhn. He is presaging Kuhn's work, but he's going much further than Kuhn and much deeper. Because if you read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, you see that Thomas Kuhn does think that there's an objective reality. He just follows Kant in saying that we can't know anything about that objective reality. We can only know what our cognitive, interpretive systems allow us to perceive about that reality, right? And so in Kuhn, and a lot of people who come from a postmodern philosophical perspective and read Kuhn miss this in his writing because they want him to be more of a postmodern thinker than he actually is, and they're trying to appropriate him for a sort of deconstructive postmodern project. But in Kuhn, there is a fixed, biologically based cognitive structure to the human mind. The human mind is the brain, and it has a certain type of function, and the brain can be conditioned by various paradigms, meaning by various frameworks of interpretation that allow for one or another scientific theory to be elaborated. And Kuhn famously points out that the transition between these paradigms resemble political revolutions, that they're not altogether rationally justified, and the kinds of considerations that work in the shift from one paradigm to another much more resemble the upheavals that take place in sociopolitics. But Kuhn still thinks that we have this cognitive apparatus that's part of an objective reality that we just can't know because we can only know things through one or another paradigm. That's not what Fort's saying. Fort, with his notion of the dominant, is saying that all of our scientific theories and our most deeply held social beliefs, including the religious framework of one or another epoch, forms a kind of dominant discourse about what reality can be. That's why he calls it a dominant. It's not just what's dominant at a particular time, it's what dominates and marginalizes other ways of interpreting the world, whether in terms of science or in terms of religion, right? And when a dominant changes from, let's say, the dominant of the era of the Bible to the dominant of the era of modern science, it's not that, our cognitive interpretation is filtering an objective reality in a different way. Reality itself is redefined. For Charles Fort, there are no laws of nature. There are habits of nature. There are tendencies. And nature is in a reciprocal relationship with our consciousness. So again, remember, this guy is reading the quantum physics journals as they're first being published in the 1920s. And he already understands that, quote unquote, reality is not an observer independent phenomenon, that our consciousness inextricably co-constitutes physical reality. And so these dominants are frameworks of interpretation that change what the very laws of nature are from one epoch to another by relegating certain types of phenomena and experiences as impossible. And so what I suggest toward the end of Closer Encounters is that the trickster is attempting to deconstruct the current dominant and to bring a new dominant into being, which will be unlike any prior dominant, insofar as it will for the first time be a dominant that is self-conscious, that is aware of the way in which our consciousness and our interpretive filters shape reality. So that then we can have a more free relationship to the manifestation of the world. Right. And I describe this in terms of the ancient idea of the aeon, which you see first in Heraclitus. In Heraclitus' idea of the game-playing God, not God capital G, lowercase g, right? Heraclitus has this image in his fragments of the aeon that is a child at play, moving pieces in the game, cosmic game. And I identified this childlike aeon with the aeon, A-E-O-N, of the child in the writings of Aleister Crowley toward the end of Closer Encounters. And I suggest that this childlike relationship to the manifestation of reality is a kind of evolutionary leap in consciousness that this trickster is trying to solicit from us in a way that liberates us from the control system that's been imposed on us by this hyperdimensional civilization, going all the way back to Mars 250 million years before the present, going through the entire history of religious revelations.
Yeah, that idea is so extraordinary. One thing you compare, well, with respect to the ion changing, you also talk about how Lovecraft's Cthulhu may have been the superorganism that had to be. You go back to Atlantis and say that there was a rebellion in Atlantis from this control system, and the rebels had to actually, I don't know, almost like magically evoke the superorganism in the form of like a titanic monster to break out of that control system, and that now something like that might need to happen again. Do you want to say more about that? I thought that was really
sure. Well, when you go into I mean, look, Plato is always the first source about Atlantis, right? I mean, that's where we get the term Atlantis from in literary history. And if you go back to Plato's account of Atlantis in Timaeus and Critias, and also you put other Platonic texts next to that, like Cratylus, which is important as well, because there are these other texts, I believe, like Cratylus, where Plato talks about how the gods had divided Earth into various realms, gods and goddesses. So that, for example, Athens was the realm of Athena, which is why it's called Athens, was the dominion of Athena. In other texts that should be set next to his account of Atlantis and Timaeus and Critias, Plato talks about how the Olympians had divided the earth amongst themselves. And there was one realm, the realm of Poseidon, which ultimately wound up being ruled by Atlas, and therefore named Atlantis, the realm of Atlas. There was one realm that became more powerful than the others and basically incited humanity to a rebellion against the Olympian gods. And this realm went around basically liberating the entire planet. This is described from an Olympian sympathetic perspective as invading the rest of the planet. But really what's going on here, if you identify with the Atlanteans, is they are engaging in a revolutionary war of liberation on the planet, trying to free the rest of humanity from the Olympians, who they already have thrown off as their overlords, who they already have ceased to worship and revere, right? And so with this titanic hubris, as Zeus sees it, these Atlanteans lead a rebellion against Olympus, and in retaliation, Zeus calls a convocation of the gods, and he basically causes all these earthquakes, and he floods their civilization, right? So what I evoke toward the end of Closer Encounters is the situation of the Atlanteans, who were, after all, a seafaring people. They're described in Plato's writings as having conquered the world through its oceans with this tremendous navy that they had, which interestingly enough included submarines as well. And so I ask the reader to put himself back in the position of an Atlantean, right? You're in this world governed by Olympian overlords. And for all we know, if we realized that the moon is artificial and that the moon is like a gigantic warden's post over the prison that is this planet, when you look up, you're looking up at prison bars. The stars to you as an Atlantean are like holes in a dome of a prison. So, you know, our impulse, our naive impulse, is to look up at the stars as sort of a transcendental field of escape from our earthly condition. But if you had a whole civilization that in effect became aware that it's living in the Matrix and that it's got these overlords, literally overlords, celestially bearing down on them and attempting to maintain their hold over the Atlanteans as basically not just colonial subjects, but property, then you have to look somewhere else for your freedom. You know, you can't look up the stars are a reminder of your servitude. And so what I suggest in Closer Encounters is that the Atlanteans, being a seafaring people, being a naval power, looked down into the depths of Gaia. They looked into the depths of the earth, and they summoned something up from the depths, both literally the depths of the ocean, but also metaphorically the depths of the psyche. In other words, a Typhonian force that is chaotically irrational to the point where it can outmaneuver these overlords, right? So the point that I make there is that any machination which would be comprehensible to the Atlantean mind could also be comprehended by the Olympian overlords. And by the way, we're in the same situation today. Okay, so any bright idea that we get into our heads about how to rebel against these overlords, you know, whatever bright idea the Pentagon has had or the CIA or whatever, and this is why they don't talk about these things, because they know that their bright ideas are actually various forms of futile stupidity that are not going to succeed. In any case, whatever rational machination we come up with, the overlords are already going to be 3 steps ahead of us. So the Atlanteans had to channel an irrational consciousness that was beyond their own comprehension and turn it against these overlords. And for that, they reached down into the depths. And so I suggest that it's possible that this thing didn't just come haphazardly through a spatiotemporal vortex in the ocean. It was summoned.
Right.
And this is humanity. It's like that, you know, the painting on the Sistine Chapel. It's like the future consciousness that we may evolve into someday, which maybe is more like an octopus than like a human being. That thing is being summoned by a trapped humanity in order to free humanity up for the evolutionary possibilities that are being constrained by the hyperdimensional civilization responsible for, you know, these abductions and these implants and so on and so forth. So that's basically what I suggest there. Yes, that, and I draw here on Tracy Twyman's work, interpreting the old ones of the Cthulhu mythos in terms of the Atlantean kings and the mythology of Atlantis. And her idea that even if only subconsciously, Lovecraft was basically elaborating a certain version of the Atlantean mythos when he was developing this whole super story of Cthulhu and the old gods and so forth. That effectively Cthulhu is like the banner of the rebel Atlanteans. Like if you think in terms of Game of Thrones, you have the Ironborn people who have the squid on their black banner, their naval black banner. Cthulhu is like that totem of the Typhonian god of the abyss that these people summoned from the depths in order to fight celestial overlords, what Fork calls celestial Tamerlanes, that have been manipulating humanity throughout its history.
Can you just, I know how are you with time? Or we're getting, it's too.
Well, we don't want to tire out the audience. That's something we need to keep in mind. So.
Well, just two more things I think would be good to talk about. One, I want to ask you about the Prometheon as an aeon and also Promethea. And then I thought that, you know, the last thing we could talk about is the UFO abduction hybridization program with respect to this superorganism trying to create trying to interface with us through the production of a child. And in reference back to Crowley, he said that we're in the eon of Horus, and Horus is the child, so it's the eon of the child. Previous eons were the eon of the father, that was the eon of Osiris, which had to do with paternalistic religions, and then you had the eon of Isis, the mother, which is the more matrifocal or religions in the ancient past. And so now, as you were suggesting, the eon of the child, eon of Horus, has a connection with what you were saying. I just totally went off on a tangent there, but back to the Prometheon idea.
So this is where Closer Encounters connects to my project of Prometheism in a particularly clear way. What I suggest at the end of this book is that this trickster has a precognitive or presentient mentality, okay? Zarathustra in his Gathas described this as Sepanta Minu, or the progressive mentality, the forward-thinking mentality, that which always thinks ahead. And then the Greeks used the word Prometheia for this, from which we get the name Prometheus, the Titan of forethought. And in various incidents, like the one at Skinwalker Ranch that I described earlier involving that camera, and many other phenomena that took place there, there is a kind of precognitive sentience that this phenomenon displays. Dr. John Alexander came up with that term, precognitive sentient phenomena. He was one of the 8 scientists working at Skinwalker Ranch. And so this trickster has in common with Prometheus that quality which is, quintessential to Prometheus, and which is, effectively the epitomizing quality of Prometheus as a Titan. And Prometheus is a trickster. I mean, Prometheus is the ultimate trickster in the Western world, right? Because Hermes is also a trickster, but Hermes is a courier for Zeus, who's a sadistic overlord. So there are limits to the extent that that we can consider Hermes really, or Mercury, an all-out trickster. So what I suggest toward the end of this book is that this trickster that can take many different forms, that manifests as owls, that shapeshift into greys, that projects mantids in order to convey symbolic information about procreation and egolessness and the relationship between eros and terror and all of these really deep aspects of human existence, this trickster that can take all these forms, including the men in black, right? And probably incubi and succubi and so forth in the medieval period. A lot of the fairy encounters, I think, demonstrate the sense of humor that is characteristic of this trickster. If this trickster can take all these forms, including some forms that are very terrifying, like these blue orbs that I describe in the book that manifested on Skinwalker Ranch, perhaps we can channel and shape the form that this trickster takes in the new aeon. And what form of the trickster, what face, what mask of the trickster is most constructive for humanity? What particular manifestation of the trickster would be most empowering to humanity? Well, obviously Prometheus. There's no myth concerning a trickster figure in all cultures throughout history on Earth that is more humanistically empowering than the trickster mythos of Prometheus. And so I think it's possible that depending on how we engage with this intelligence through the close encounter phenomenon, we can solicit and elicit the manifestation of this trickster as what I call Promethea, the aeon, the Prometheon, Promethea aeon, which I see as a kind of cosmic intelligence of which Prometheus himself is an avatar. So this is like a superordinate being that is redefining, at the end of my book, Closer Encounters, what I mean when I say Prometheism. So Prometheism now becomes not just about Prometheus, the civilizer god and Titan who struggled against the Devas, the Ashura who's struggling against the Devas, the kind of figure you see in the Mesopotamian myths of Enki or the South American myths of Quetzalcoatl. Promethea is not just about that Prometheus figure as he appears in various mythologies. Prometheism is ultimately about our relationship with Promethea, with the aeon Promethea. which is the shape that the trickster can take that will be most empowering to humanity and most conducive to the further evolution of our social consciousness.
I think that's awesome, and that can segue just into. I know you wanted me to touch on a couple of the ideas in my thesis on alchemy and UFOs. So, but yeah, so just briefly, one thing is that the way Mercurius is described, if I'm saying that right, by many alchemists, and as Jung summarizes in his paper on Mercurius, which is a different paper than on the psychology of the trickster, which I know you examined that in this new book. This superorganism that can assume all these shapes and all these forms, that's exactly how Mercurius is described, which is the alchemical Mercury. It's seen as the alpha and omega of the operation, the alchemical opus, and Jung talks about how it can be a savior figure, a psychopomp, but also it's Lucifer, and all the images and all of the operations of alchemy, all the materials are also synonymous with Mercurius, or equated sometimes. So I think that's interesting, because when I was reading about that superorganism and the trickster aspect of it, that's where my mind went to. That Mercurius is one way of thinking about that, but what you're saying is that the kind of trickster the mask that we want the trickster to wear with respect to the situation we're in would be Prometheus. And so anyway, and then Mercurius was sort of like the patron deity of alchemy, basically. And so all I was doing in my thesis was I was just looking at the fact that there were parallels that I saw. And at the time, this was when I was at school studying Jungian psychology and archetypal psychology. So I was looking at it from a Jungian perspective, though I had to add in Jung's ideas were too reductive. So I had to incorporate stuff from Gebser and this guy named Jeffrey Raff, who talks about the psychoid unconscious. But just briefly, I saw parallels between the alchemical work to produce the Philosopher's Stone, which is sometimes symbolized as the Filius Philosophorum, the child of the philosophers, and what's happening in the flying saucer, which is also often egg-shaped, just like the Hermetic vessel is often egg-shaped, and so it seemed like maybe this cosmic trickster that can produce a certain subset of close encounters is trying to is this sort of cosmic alchemist, that it's actually transforming the human being in a way that parallels the alchemical production of the Philosopher's Stone as a child, by producing these hybrids that seem to be a way in which perhaps this cosmic trickster could be interfacing with us and helping us transform into a new species that could perhaps transcend this control system. And then one thing where parallels with what you were writing is that you talk about how the control system even cuts into death, basically, and evidence from the near-death experience suggests to you that this five-dimensional civilization that has us trapped in this prison also manages the afterlife experience in order to use our souls for reincarnation for other purposes. So one thing that I was talking about was that something that's happening within this hybridization between the human and the alien, or which could be this cosmic trickster or Mercurius or whatever, is actually producing a subtle body that is like a psychophysical vehicle that will allow humanity to actually survive death and be able to add novelty into the rest of the universe, participate creatively in the universe. And then one last thing was that I was looking at the fact that the alien grays are very undefined. They're not individual, as you point out as well. And as John Mack says, they seem very interested in our embodiment and our emotions and our individuality. So I was kind of looking at, there's some kind of a trade-off going on where like the sort of pleromatic consciousness of the alien other gets to experience incarnation, human individuality, whereas human beings get to participate in this world that's outside of the control system. So I don't know. Do you want to say anything about that?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, I agree with everything you said.
Oh, and did you want me to show that picture too?
Sure.
Really,
what you're talking about here is the upshot of my whole book. I mean, this is really, where the various arguments of my book culminate. In the idea that you have the diagram.
I'm suddenly
in the idea that this trickster is engaged in a kind of alchemical enterprise. And I draw a distinction between two types of grays, where basically I identify the grays that have been seen in conjunction with the Nordics as a basically type of biological robot that works for the Nordics in order to handle abductees and so forth. I mean, there have been many reports, like from Travis Walton, Whitley Strieber, and so forth, of these Nordics seen together with certain type of grays, and these grays appear to be like diminutive biological robots that work for these Nordics. But the devil's in the details. Those grays have hands, and they wear uniforms and so forth. And there's another kind of gray that's something else. And sometimes it looks more like an owl, and sometimes it looks more like a gray. And there are particular details to its appearance that suggest it's a kind of shamanic phenomenon. Like it has talons and claws and so forth. I think that this type of gray is actually the one that's really involved in the hybridization program, and that people like David Jacobs are making a big mistake when they think that if an abductee recounting their involvement in the hybridization program, in other words, like these women who are pregnant for 2-3 months and then lose their fetuses and so forth, that when these abductees say that they saw an owl, what's going on is that these robot grays are just projecting a screen image into their minds. I don't think so. I think that if you look at the details of the hybridization program, at the fine-grained texture of the experiences recounted by people like, let's say, David Huggins, the artist, whose experiences I go into at some length in my book, the hybridization program has a lot more in common with alchemy than it does with anything involving robots and, I don't know, frozen fetuses and so on and so forth. Which is not to say there isn't technology involved, right? I mean, what technology looks like on the other side of what I call the spectral revolution is something very different from how we conceive of very materialistic mechanical technology. It's a kind of psychotronic technique.
Right.
And so I do think, as you suggested, that the hybrids that people describe as looking like a cross between us and the grays, these children or diminutive people with really pointy chins and large eyes and, this wispy, like platinum hair, they actually, oddly enough, look like characters from out of Japanese anime, which makes me wonder about where the Japanese are getting this from, because these characters in anime don't look like Japanese people. Be that, and of course, anime is very science fictional in terms of its discourse. So be that as it may, we'll bracket that. It's a subject that I went into in Prometheus and Atlas in one of my chapters there. But yeah, I think that these hybrids are like the homunculuses of the alchemists of the medieval period. That there is an attempt being made by this Prometheon to create a new form of, I was going to say man, but the point is that it is what comes after man. That it is an attempt to foster the evolution of a life form beyond man. And also relevant in this regard is what you said about, I forget exactly how you put it, but like transmogrification, transmutation, right? Charles Fort believed that, I think he wrote about this in his book Wild Talents, which focuses mostly on various types of psychic and telekinetic abilities. He believed that there was a certain super psi, what we call today super psi ability, that is the root of all specific psychic powers and abilities. And he called it a transmedium capability. Not transmedium like people talk about UFOs today, going through the air and the ocean, but it may be related to that sense of transmedium in a way that these UAP researchers haven't considered. But he talks about a transmedium phenomenon that is a kind of power of transmutation and transformation that is at the root of all specific psychic powers and also transcends them, right? And so I think the trickster, that thing which underlies these various phenomena that it manifests, is of that nature. It is a transmedium phenomenon, and it is transmuting human existence into some other form of life, something which we experience as alien, because we have not yet undergone the full process of transformation into what that is. And the hybrids are, they're an integral part of that process, let's say, okay? And there may be symbolic dimensions to this hybridization program that exceed any literalist interpretation of these as like genetically engineered entities. And as you put it, may have a lot more in common with alchemy. Something to keep in mind is that a lot of these grays, the kind that I'm describing as, you know, shifting back and forth into the form of owls and that have a shamanic quality to them, they smell like sulfur. This is an almost universal description by close encounter experiencers. And the men in black who materialize, you know, out of dark corners are sometimes described as smelling like sulfur. The bell, which is the 0-point energy device supposedly powering UFOs and responsible for their anti-gravitic propulsion, that anti-gravitic propulsion device runs on mercury. When you read this book, don't think that's lost on me, even though we specifically point that out, that mercury is the serum, it is the medium at the center of the power of the UFO, and that these entities smell sulfurous, which is what demonic entities supposedly smell like, right? They smell hell, the depths of hell or whatever, in medieval theology. So yeah, there's something going on here.
And just to point that out, mercury and sulfur and salt are the three major elements in alchemy. Yeah.
Yeah, and salt is associated with the ocean.
It's wild stuff, man. It's wild. Yeah, it's great.
We probably shouldn't say more than that because, you know.
Yeah. No, I think that.
If we keep going.
Yeah.
We'll have lost enough sleep as it is.
Right. Yeah, but we could go on this particular subject for forever. But yeah. So we'll have to do it again soon, or whenever you want. I appreciate this, Jason. Thank you for.
And it's been my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you soon. I should be back over on that side before too long.
Awesome, cool. Looking forward to it. Thanks,
So
Jason.
take care, my friend. I'm going to to close it up here, and thank you to everybody who had the patience for 2.5 hours of terror. Take care, Michael. Thank you again.